Good morning. Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted to be sharing a live audience with Professor Alister McGrath. How are you doing, Professor?
I'm really good, and it's very nice to be here with you.
So, Professor, I've been following your work for many, many years. In fact, I believe you were the first person that everyone looked up to after the publication of The God Delusion. How does it feel having that much burden on your shoulders?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the new atheism has really disappeared since then, but it was very interesting just to see how this movement rose and then faded away. So it's interesting to see how very often what one generation thinks is absolutely right is rejected by another generation. So it's interesting.
It is indeed. And one of the things I was thinking about last night, I was rewatching your discussion with Dawkins going back some, I think 15 years, 15 or so years ago. And it seems like many of the things that you're now speaking about, these were the sorts of things that you predicted were going to happen in terms of why we look for meaning, why we look for purpose, why these things are a necessary element of what it means to be human, as opposed to, just making up fictional illusions which are not really useful.
Well, I think that's right. I think that people have become much more aware, particularly with the growing crisis on mental health of younger people, of just how important stable intellectual frameworks, moral values, and above all, a deep sense of personal meaning really matter to us. And my concern about the new atheism was it didn't really engage these questions at all. And one of my other concerns really was that these questions have been addressed by traditional religions such as Christianity, and their input on this matter wasn't really being taken very seriously. I think we're now in a much better place to have a very serious conversation about some very important issues.
Absolutely. And so this brings me on to your fantastic book, Why We Believe. I'm so happy to have you on the stream because this was just published a few days ago. And I believe it's one of the best books I've read in many, many years because, I mean, there's a section here where you talk about how facts are not enough, right? I really love this particular section. And I think many of the discourses surrounding atheism and theism and belief, it's around what the facts lead to. But you take a different route. You talk about the fact that factuality, it seems, is not in itself a guarantor of existential traction. So why did you write this book, and why is it important for the audience to understand this isn't just about facts? This is about something way more important.
Well, I wrote the book because I was asked to by an editor who felt there was a real need to just make it increasingly obvious that actually everyone has beliefs and that mere facts aren't good enough. And I was very happy to rise to that challenge. So this is the book we have as a result of that. It's called Why We Believe. It's not a question mark. It's just saying we do believe. Get used to it. And I think one of the points that you're bringing out very clearly here is that there are lots of facts we can be absolutely sure about. For example, 2 and 2 make 4, or I'm sitting at my desk talking to you right now. But so what? I mean, what is the deeper significance of these things? Because factuality on its own isn't enough. We need a system of meaning. We're human beings, and everyone now knows, thanks to psychology and anthropology, just how important these things are to human beings. And my point is, if we are going to flourish as human beings, we need to believe, to develop meaning systems. And if we don't do that, then we are less than human. So it's a very important statement about who we are as human beings, not simply about this whole idea of believing.
Absolutely. And one of the things I love in the book is how you've intertwined your personal journey with the historical realities that happened in the 20th century, 21st century. And what's interesting is how your journey dovetails nicely with the philosophical sort of narrative throughout the book. So I want to begin off with something which I think a lot of viewers may not actually know about you, which is that you started off studying biophysics at Oxford and then you switched to theology. Most viewers know you as a theologian. Now, obviously, you've excelled in that. You became the professor of divinity, a position that was established in 1597. And I was thinking, well, if you carried on down that Marxist understanding you initially had, maybe you would have excelled in biophysics. But why did you take theology so seriously when others like Dawkins, they just thought of this as not even a topic?
Because as a younger person, although I was very, very clear, I was looking for a big picture of reality. And initially, as a teenager, I thought I found it in Marxism. And of course, that's one of the reasons why I was an atheist. That gave me intellectual justification for being an atheist. But I think one of the things I began to realize was that there were problems with Marxism. But the key thing I think to bring out here is that I was looking for a system of meaning. I wanted to be able to step into a worldview where there was space for me, where in effect I could say, I see how I fit into this bigger scheme of things. It gives me personal meaning. It gives me a sense of who I am and what I ought to be doing in reality. And so I discovered Christianity, and actually part is because I was beginning to react against Marxism. I felt it was perhaps evidentially underdetermined, if I can put it like that. And I hadn't really taken Christianity serious. And then when I began to read in detail, I began to discover this is actually very, very interesting. And so I had arrived at Oxford University to study natural sciences. I was a chemist to begin with, and I did my doctorate in the biomedical sciences. But I was really saying this stuff about meaning and significance is so important. I really want to switch to theology. And it's not that I lost interest in science, just that something else came along to supplant it. In fact, interestingly, my doctoral supervisor died late last year, and I went to see him in his old age just before his death, and we had a long talk, and he was fascinated by this whole business about meaning, and he said, you're one of my most interesting research students because you've seen the need to explore that question. I think it's an important question. I think many people listening to our conversation will say, actually, that matters for me as well.
Absolutely. And I really want you to recall a incident which and you mentioned in the book. You were traveling through Iran, you were traveling through the city of Kerman, and you had this type of road to Damascus moment, or maybe epiphany about the cosmos. And the beautiful description in your book of that is something which I really recommend readers to read for themselves. But if you can just go over that experience, Professor, and how that shaped your way of thinking.
Well, back in the days when I was a scientific research student, I had some friends at Oxford, and one of them was an Iranian who was studying nuclear physics. And he said to me and some of my friends, look, come and see me sometime in Iran. It's a lovely place. You'll enjoy it. So we did. We went out to Iran, and one night we were traveling through the desert on the way from one city to another. And you travel at night to avoid the heat of the day. And the bus broke down in the middle of a desert. And I got out and wandered around, and it was completely silent. The sky was brilliant with starlight. And I'd never seen such brilliance in England here. You have light pollution and it rains all the time. So it was it blew me away. It really made me realize how small I was, how big the universe was. And again, just brought home to me, we need to think about who we are. Do we have meaning in the midst of this vast universe? Or do, in effect, we have to accept there's no meaning at all and just do the best we can? So it really brought home to me the importance of looking for existential meaning. It's not running away from anything. It's about trying to find out who we are as human beings and what the best way of actually living meaningfully in the world is.
Yeah. And, one of the things you highlight is this is a sentiment that's shared by Dawkins. He also speaks about the feeling that you get when you study biological systems, and he's even spoken about how studying certain molecular structures has made him almost collapse in terms of how he feels about that. But one of the things that you highlight in the book is this is not a scientific experience. This is something more than that.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, Dawkins does describe very well his sense of, he uses the word mystery, meaning in effect, look, we can't fully take this in. He's right in that. But the question is, where does this take you? Do you simply say, we're going to walk away from this because it doesn't lead anywhere? Or do you want to say, this is significant? Let me step through the doorway that this experience opens. I think for me, one of the things is that we need to just make clear that science is very, very good at what it does. The question is, what else is there that needs to be said? Science, if you like, is wonderful at illuminating part of our world, but not all of it. And when it comes to, how our universe functions, science is brilliant. When it comes to questions about what the universe means, or indeed what I or you mean, well, it doesn't really help us very much at all, apart from saying these questions really matter to people, which is what psychology brings out so clearly. So I think, if I can put it like this, it's almost like I've made a decision to have stereoscopic vision. If you like, this is my scientific eye, this is my theological eye. And when you use them together, they give you a depth which neither on their own can give. So really what I'm arguing in this book is that we need to find a way of, in effect, finding meaning and taking these questions very, very seriously, and not dismissing them as part of a superstitious past that we can now live behind. They are part of who we are as human beings. To flourish as a human being, you need to take that question seriously.
Yeah, and I really love the way you explain that, in terms of you have the empirical eye and then you have, if you like, the spiritual eye. One of the things I remember in your discussion with Dawkins, you mentioned that God is the grounding of explanation. So it's not just about the probability of if there is a God or not, but God is a lens, a conceptual lens from which everything else makes sense. And from the discussion, what I saw is he wasn't really admitting that he also has a lens, because everyone, like you've argued in this brilliant book, everyone does have a starting point. You do actually believe in something.
Well, that's right. And in the philosophy of science, there's this area of study called theory-laden observation. And it's simply saying, let's just be honest about this. We all approach our understanding of nature with preconceived ideas about what it is and what's like, and they might be wrong. We need to change our minds if appropriate. So it's a very important point. And certainly one of the things I discovered is not that science is wrong. I would never say that. It's brilliant. But that it has its limits, and we need to go beyond those limits, not to leave science behind, but rather to bring science to fulfillment by helping it to dialogue with other disciplines and see this bigger and richer picture. So to me, my science as a going back as an Oxford student many years ago, remains very much part of who I am. But if you like, I've now added to it and got a deeper and richer vision of reality, which I hope in no way displaces science, other than rejecting the idea that science on its own answers all of life's big questions.
Absolutely. And just to key off what you've said, I recently interviewed Peter Harrison, and he's been arguing in his books and from a historical perspective that it was the theology that gave the grounding for the science to flourish. So when we look at the early scientists, they were believers, right? And that believing framework allowed them to hold beliefs which facilitated the scientific method's not only progress, but the development of the method itself.
Well, that's absolutely right. The example I would give is Johann Kepler, the man who, in effect, really established that the planets orbit around the sun in ellipses. And if you read his writings, I mean, they are full of theology, the idea that God has made us with this inbuilt capacity to make sense of the world, that the deep harmonies of the universe actually have their grounding in God. And you see here that this idea that science and religion are permanently in conflict, it's nonsense. I mean, Kepler saw them as being, part of the same quest for wisdom and knowledge. And really, this idea that science and religion are at war with each other is quite a late 19th century invention, which actually reflects the social conditions of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something else I was thinking about. In one section of your book, you mentioned the opening of Psalms, in which it speaks about the greatness of the universe and the smallness of man. And in a very beautiful description, we get this sense of awe when we're reading, about where we are within this grand universe. And I got the feeling that this is the same sort of sentiment that you get when you read River Out of Eden, but from an atheistic perspective, because both paradigms are giving the observer different realities to look at. But if you don't start off with the belief in God, then you have a totally different experience. But one of the things that you argue in the book is it's not the facts, it's not the observation, it's not the empirical data, it's the lens which gives you that experience. And you link this to Kuhn's philosophy. And I just want you to elaborate on that, because I think it's really important to look at the role of paradigms and how they shape the way that we look at experience.
Well, I think that's a very good point. And certainly, Thomas Kuhn had this very famous notion of a paradigm shift. You begin by looking at something this way. And as more and more evidence accumulates, you begin to realize, actually, it doesn't work. It's not good enough. We need a new way of looking at this. And I use that phrase a bit because I think it's very helpful. And what I would say is that in my own case, which may not be typical or representative, I began by taking a purely scientific angle on the universe. That was my only lens through which I looked at the world. And I began to realize that actually this lens was inadequate on its own, that we needed to have something else as well. And so that's why I used that image of the spectacles a moment ago. You cannot limit yourself to a single lens for making sense of the world. You may need several, and then you've got to figure out how they work together. But the key point, I think, to appreciate here is that we all look at the world through certain ways that we think are natural, and very often they're not natural. They're cultural constructions, they're things we've inherited from the past or from influential friends. And we need to be willing to, I think, expand these or indeed change these as we begin to realize that they do not give us adequate traction on the universe in all of its fullness.
Absolutely. And I wanted your perspective on changing paradigms. So one of the things that Kuhn highlights is that the change of a paradigm from one to another, which obviously in the case of something like physics would change the way that you look at mass, change the way that you look at space and time. He argued that that change in paradigm is not a rational choice, right? It's like those images. It looks like a rabbit or it looks like a woman, right? It's like, I think he used the term gestalt shift, right? What do you think about that? Because the arguments that we've been hearing from the logical positivists and the new atheists is, well, it's all facts which lead you to a certain conclusion, but it seems like it's more than facts. There's something else beyond that.
Well, I think that's a very important point you've just made. The facts on their own are not adequate to bring us to a firm conclusion about the way the universe is. And Aristotle realized that, and certainly the rediscovery of this insight in the late 19th century, which lies behind Kuhn's approach, is very significant because, in effect, the facts don't lead us directly to a theory. What we do is we, in effect, say there's several ways we could explain this. Let's try working out what they are and then testing them about how reliably they're able to take account of the observations. In other words, it's not going directly from observation to theory. It's going from observations to generation of possible theoretical explanations, then trying to figure out which is the best. And here's the killer point. The best may simply be our best option at this moment in time. It may change as we move on, or it may only be part of a bigger picture. And we need to find other lenses that can supplement this in various ways. So I think as I read Dawkins, I see a slightly dated understanding of how the method of scientific discovery works. I think we're much more attentive now to the realization that very often what makes us say we need a better worldview is not necessarily factual. Very often it's something, we have a stimulus from somewhere that makes us rethink. For example, think of the Kekule's discovery of benzene, where in effect he was trying to work out how this thing worked. He was looking at his coal fire burning in front of him, and suddenly he had a picture of a possible explanation. Went out, tested it, it worked. It's an irrational way of discovering it, but hey, it led him to a conclusion that seemed to work. So we need to be aware that science is not as completely rational as you might think. There's a very important role for the imagination. That's why a scientist like Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize for medicine some years ago, who said, in effect, we have to be clear, the scientific method rests on the imagination, constructing new theoretical possibilities and then checking them out against the evidence. And that's how human beings function, actually, not just in relation to science, but in terms of trying to figure out the meaning of life as well.
Absolutely. And in one of your earlier books, The Dawkins Delusion, you highlight that Dawkins himself makes the admission in A Devil's Chaplain that future scientists of the 21st century may discover things that will make us, challenge Darwinism or discard it. So, science evolves, science changes, and to make theological arguments based upon our current scientific understanding is quite a weak position. I also wanted to highlight here that one of the first things that yourself and Professor Dawkins discussed in that famous debate was the definition of faith. Now, you're quite clear that he is wrong in his definition of faith and how believers have defined it. And, he doesn't accept that he has faith. He doesn't accept that he starts off not just with the facts, but there's something beyond that. So could you just explain the importance of accepting that we all are believers, whether we're naturalists, atheists, or anything else?
Well, it's a really quite simple point. I mean, when I was an atheist myself, I believed that there was no God, and thought that everybody who did believe in God was outdated, stupid, mad, bad, or sad. But I did find myself having dark moments of doubt in which I began to say to myself, you can't prove there is no God. And you're working on the assumption there's no God. It's actually a position of faith. You believe there is no God. And I find that very disturbing. Many atheists listening to our discussion will say, I know exactly what you mean. And the point I would make is this. Atheism can mean various things. For some people, atheism is simply saying, we don't talk about the God question. It's not interesting. Others would say, no, we believe there is no God. And Dawkins certainly is in that category. But the problem is, I would simply say to him that you seem to be allowing one standard of justification for yourself, which you are not applying to other people. And, really what I would say is there's an epistemic disparity between Dawkins' attitude to science and his attitude towards religion. He's in fact saying, I don't need to defend my position, but you need to defend your position. And I think that philosophers like, for example, the Australian atheist philosopher Graham Oppy makes a very important point, which he says, look, atheism, theism, and agnosticism, they're all rationally permissible, but none of them are rationally conclusive. In other words, they're all options, but none of them can be shown to be right. Therefore, if you choose one of them, in effect, you're making a step of faith. And that's really the point I try to make in this book. Actually, there isn't anything wrong with this. This is just the way we are as human beings. We've evolved, if you like, to make these judgments and live by them. And belief is not an aberration to be set to one side. It's necessary to flourishing in this world. And so in many ways, this book is saying, look, let's just embrace this and live with it and see where it takes us.
Absolutely. And one of the things I really loved about this book is how it speaks about the contemporary sort of movements that we've seen on social media, which in a way give us an insight into the way that the masses view these types of philosophies and the implications of them. So you highlight Peterson, right? And you make the link between Peterson and Viktor Frankl. What I found interesting, and I wanted your thoughts on this, is we saw in the early 2000s and then, maybe post 2015, we saw that new atheism rose and then it declined. But while it was declining, you had the likes on social media of Peterson and others that were speaking about meaning, value, purpose, and these types of things. And very clearly, we could see that new atheists were turning towards these philosophies, even though ontologically they may not subscribe to the traditional belief in an Abrahamic God, but they needed something. And the popularity of still people like Viktor Frankl and Peterson and others, it goes to show that human beings have a, if you like, a meaning hole or a purpose hole, something that is not satisfied purely by the hard empirical data that new atheism wanted to give them.
Well, I think that's right. And I think Jordan Peterson's very interesting because, of course, his early book, Maps of Meaning, is simply him as a psychologist saying, look, here is how meaning is so important to human beings, and here's how they go about constructing meaning. And I know many people are critical of Jordan Peterson, but my response to them would be, look, Peterson is addressing real questions that matter to people, and other guys are just dismissing these questions, saying, we don't want to talk about these. We need to talk about this question of meaning because it's so important. And you've mentioned mentioned Viktor Frankl. We could also look at anthropologists, for example, Clifford Geertz, who in effect has this very famous statement: "We are meaning-seeking animals." Well, I mean that's a very good description of human beings. You know, we need to recognize who we are as human beings. If it is natural for human beings to seek for meaning, to believe what certain answers might be to those questions, then to refuse to engage those questions is simply to be less than human. To reject meaning is to dehumanize. And in many ways, my book is simply saying to be an authentic human being is to recognize how important belief is and the quest for meaning is.
Yeah. And you've had a discussion not only with Dawkins but also Christopher Hitchens, and one of the things that you highlight is their narrative that beliefs are on a spectrum of weird to toxic, or we could go even beyond toxic, as in they can lead to violence. And linking faith and beliefs with violence is a very problematic thing, because number one, we have to make the distinction between beliefs and institutions. What, for example, is the beliefs of Marxism and the institutions that the communist states had, but also the fact that if we were to look at how these beliefs have been used from a colonial perspective or from other historical perspectives, we could make the same argument that, okay, new atheism took off primarily because of 9/11, and primarily because of a lot of violence that erupted in the world at that time. But we cannot neglect, and as you pointed out to Dawkins, we cannot neglect the history of state atheism in the 20th century. So the door swings both ways if someone was to make that argument.
Well, that's right. Isaiah Berlin, who was a very famous philosopher here at Oxford some time ago, made the point that both Marx and Lenin, in effect, took the view that their ideologies were right, and therefore anybody who rejected them was evil or a fool, and therefore they ought to be eliminated. So you can see there's a real issue here about the capacity of ideologies of many kinds, secular and religious, to in effect go in very, very dangerous directions. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very, very clear that belief is a natural human instinct. It's a good instinct. But like everything human beings do, it can go wrong. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of this book is about how to prevent beliefs from becoming toxic. They're not toxic in themselves, but when they're abused, for example, in the pursuit of power, they can go wrong.
Yes. And I think one of the things that's important to also highlight here is our sort of understanding of where new atheism is as a sociological movement. It's not an accident of history, or there's certain political events that led to its demise. This was something that was pretty much predicted by the likes of yourself and other thinkers, because of this deficit, this inability to address these types of things.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, when the New Atheism erupted in 2006 with Richard Dawkins' God Delusion and other books by Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and later Christopher Hitchens. I mean, there was this sense, which I remember very, very well here at Oxford, that this is the dawn of a new age of certainties, that in effect, we're now leaving behind these old-fashioned ways of thinking. The future is bright, it's brilliant, it's new atheist. I remember thinking, how long will it be before the penny drops and people realize this is just another belief system which is equally flawed as any other belief system, and will lose its appeal very, very quickly. And I do remember discussing with Christopher Hitchens a problem I had with what he was saying, which is that he had this very, very robust critique of religion, but he didn't really offer anything in its place. And if he had, my criticism would have been, you are just giving us an alternative belief system, not a set of factual statements which can be verified absolutely. But in effect, one of the real problems is that it's one thing to say we think this way of thinking is wrong, but so what? You've then got to say, here is what is right, and here is how it can be shown to be right. And it's that second side of things that New Atheism found very, very difficult to deal with. And its failure to secure existential traction with people, I think, was a major contribution to its decline.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I found was really interesting is in your book, you speak about the rise of nones, those who don't subscribe to a religion. And you point out to a recent study in which these nones, these non-religious segment of society, they do actually endorse alternative supernatural beliefs. So they're actually driven by the same cognitive biases that underpin more conventional religious beliefs. So the way that the new atheism proponents tried to spin the rise of these nones was, well, this is evidence that new atheism is working, when you actually argue, well, they're just switching from one belief system to another.
Well, I think that's a very important point, and certainly all the surveys dealing with what are called religious nuns makes the point that very often what makes them react against religion is religious institutions or very dogmatic religious people. But when you begin to say, well, okay, they say they are not religious, what do they actually believe? And they're very happy to talk about this. And you discover they have a remarkably interesting set of beliefs, very often about God, about the world, about a supernatural realm, about life after death. In other words, they are moving towards alternative beliefs, not away from beliefs. And that's why I think the New Atheist reading of the rise of religious nuns was very, very superficial. It just seemed to think it was obvious these guys are atheists. Well, no, they are not. They are people who are constructing new religious or metaphysical identities, which don't really map easily onto the old-fashioned maps we had from the earlier 20th century.
Absolutely. And this is a nice segue into something that you wrote, which I really loved. You write that we have some inbuilt desire to find a big picture which helps us feel that we are part of something greater than ourselves, enabling us to position ourselves within this larger map of reality and live accordingly. And this reminds me of, I've forgotten the name of the author, but he spoke about the Immortality Project, that every human being needs an immortality project that they can subscribe to. It could be nationalism, socialism, religion, or even, bringing human rights to the rest of the world, or whatever it is. But we have this inbuilt desire.
Well, we do. And Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, just makes the point that when we've managed to find food and shelter, we begin to think deep thoughts about who we are, about what the universe is all about. And the problem is a lot of people want to shut that down. And my book is saying, let's open it up and look at how important belief is in helping us to construct not simply our understanding of how this world works, but also how we fit into it. And again, you're making a very good point, because we are dealing with a mental health crisis, it seems, particularly amongst younger people. And part of that is a feeling that there is no meaning, no significance. I don't matter. And of course, psychologists bring home very, very clearly how important that instinct is. And if you're going to look for meaning, then in effect, you're going to have to develop beliefs. Things you can't prove to be true, but you can trust. In other words, your head says you can't be absolutely sure, but your heart says, I think this is right and I trust it. And it's going to change the way I see the world. So if you like, what this book is trying to do is to say that to orientate ourselves towards a future which is nothing like what New Atheism predicted. It's an era of uncertainty, or of bewilderment. We really do need to reclaim belief as a tool to help us figure out who we are and what we can do in this increasingly complex and chaotic world.
Yeah, and this reminds me also of the fact that that type of false certainty which Dawkins and his collaborators wanted to project was the sort of thing that Michael Ruse and others pointed out was quite fallacious. And I believe it was in a review of your book, or is maybe a part of your book, in which Michael Ruse argued that reading The God Delusion made him embarrassed to be an atheist, and he pointed out that the McGraths show why. So a lot of it has to do with, not only is it that we are machines who need we are animals who need some form of meaning. We have this this inbuilt desire for meaning. We're meaning making machines, but also that we will force ourselves to be certain of things just so that we could live our lives in a particular way. because without that sense of certainty, it's very hard to live a meaningful life. And I wanted to just read out a small sentence from the Dark Side of Believing chapter of your book. You say, yet when a society rejects the idea of God, it tends to transcendentize secular alternatives and allow them to function as alternative gods. Could you please elaborate on that point?
Well, this is a point that many writers have made. For example, the atheist philosopher John Gray makes the point that if you reject God, you find a God surrogate, his phrase, a God surrogate, something that actually functions as God but isn't God. In other words, there's this inbuilt desire to find this absolute foundation of life, this absolute foundation of morality. And religion, of course, was very much about that. But having rejected the concept of religion, you have to almost reinvent the idea of a secularized notion of transcendence. My point in the book really is that you can do that, but you need to be aware of the assumptions that are built into this. And many of these are deeply subversive of the very naive approach of the new atheism. So I think what we need to do is to say that if we recognize that there's something instinctual within human beings which says we need to find meaning, we need to find significance, then either we say this is just a delusion, let's get real, or we say no, this is a deep part of who we are as human beings. It's as real a desire as needing food, needing water, and it may contain a clue to who we really are and what we're really looking for. And my book is saying, look, let's explore that possibility and see where it takes us.
Yeah. I wanted to get your thoughts on Julian Huxley's idea of religion without revelation. So that's the title of his famous book. And one of the things he argued is evolutionary humanism should be the new religion of man. And he also predicted that in the future, the belief in God would be as irrational as someone believing that the earth is flat. And he believed that evolutionary humanism, this religion without revelation, is a good contender against traditional Abrahamic faiths. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts are quite, well, I mean, there's some good things about what Huxley is saying. I mean, he does make the point that evolution very often is more than a purely biological theory of how the biological world came to be what it is. Actually, it can be expanded to give you a metaphysical account of reality in which there is no God. Now, I fully accept that. But I want to go back to Thomas H. Huxley, who I think was Julian Huxley's grandfather. And in a very famous lecture here at Oxford in 1891 called Evolution and Ethics, Thomas Huxley simply made the point that evolution has nothing of significance to say to our evolution, to our desire for a secure morality, because in effect, it arises out of a process of violence. And once we get to a certain position, we have to, in effect, leave that behind us and begin to think big questions about meaning and identity and morality. And the evolutionary process does not help us in any way to construct those values. And it's almost as if Huxley is saying, evolution helps us to understand how we got to where we are. Now, we need to figure out things for ourselves from this point onwards, because evolution is about the survival of the fittest, the most violent, and we don't want that. So I think Julian Huxley, is really making the point that you can transform the theory of evolution from a biological theory to an existential account of reality, in which there is no God, no meaning, nothing apart from what we choose to construct. But it is a construction, and that means it's a belief. So in a curious way, Julian Huxley is proving my point for me. We need beliefs. And what he's done is he's chosen to deconstruct one set of beliefs and construct an alternative set of beliefs, which he knows perfectly well he can't prove to be true.
Yeah. And you also highlight in your book that, Darwinian theory wasn't just taken as a descriptive, from a descriptive perspective, it was also seen as a normative or prescriptive theory. And it's something that Wallace and others actually, quite candidly and openly spoke about the implications of. So, if we are going to talk about dangerous beliefs, then, well, we wouldn't call it, this is the view of Darwin, but certainly the view of the of the social Darwinists did have negative implications for large parts of the world.
Well, I think that's a very important point, and I do bring this up because I think it needs to be said very, very clearly. That's why the whole area of the public interpretation of science is very, very important. Because in the 1860s, 1870s, here in Great Britain, there were many people who argued that Darwinism, in effect, gave an intellectual foundation for the colonial enterprise. Why? Well, because the argument was that Darwin, in effect, was saying that European human beings were better than others. Like, for example, in Australasia, in New Zealand, in various other places, the argument was that Europeans exercised a civilizing influence. And if that led to the demise of other people groups, well, that was part of the Darwinian process. Mm-hmm. So there's a rather chilling, rather unsettling aspect to how Darwinism was being interpreted within Britain in the 19th century and seen as legitimating the colonial enterprise. That's something we need to be aware of. It does not discredit Darwinism. It does remind us that very often something that's good or neutral is taken by human beings and reworked in a rather toxic and unpleasant way. So I think that's a good point to make, just to bring out how it's not just a scientific theory that we're talking about, it's an interpretation of the implications of that scientific theory for example, the future of particular people groups.
Yeah. This reminds me of David Stowe's book, Darwinian Fairy Tales, in which he goes over the different schools of Darwinism. So Huxley, T.H. Huxley, he puts within the hard man of Darwinism, which is being very open, nature's red in tooth and claw. And then you get the softy approach of the socio-biologists, as they were called, and now we call it evolutionary psychology. And Dawkins makes the argument in his book for in the God Delusion for our altruism, our kind nature coming from an evolutionary past. But this is something that you've also addressed, that this is not an adequate answer.
It's not an adequate answer. At best, it's a partial answer because there are other factors involved as well. And again, I don't want to place too much emphasis on theology here, but it is very important to make the point that, for example, in the case of Christianity, a fundamental idea is that we bear God's image. And therefore, if you like, there's something within us which is nudging us in certain directions, which is saying, you don't do this to other people, you're nice to them, that sort of thing. And we need to be aware that is a significant contribution to this discussion. So my own view is that I welcome scientific insights, but I do not want them to become normative and totalizing. There's a bigger picture here, and other disciplines have very important contributions to make.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that your earlier book, The Dawkins Delusion, highlighted for the readers was essentially Dawkins is subscribing to a form of scientism, which is why he's trying to, things which are traditionally within the domain of philosophy or theology, he's making those into scientific questions. And this is also something I put to the late friend of yours and great academic of our time, Michael Roos, that, Dawkins seems to be, epistemically wedded to a form of scientism, which is, in fact, I asked him this. I asked him, is this why your perspective on these type of questions is different to his? Because you see, knowledge is being broader than just what we can acquire through science. And he actually agreed with that. So that seems to be the mother of the issue, isn't it? That scientism is the cause of a lot of these ideas being forced into the scientific domain, and then with these absurd conclusions.
I think the real danger is that one particular way of gaining knowledge is allowed to become absolutized. I mean, if I can give you, the argument you'll find in some atheist writers goes like this. I mean, science is a very good tool for looking at the world. We can therefore use it for everything. But hey, during the COVID epidemic, I would regularly check my temperature to see if there are any problems. And suppose I were to argue like this, look, this thermometer works very well for telling my temperature. Why don't I use it for everything, like the meaning of life? What is good? And it's obviously nonsense. And the key point is the scientific method is a tool, a research tool developed for application to a specific domain and is firmly understood to be discipline specific and focused on its application. You can't use it for everything. And if you do use it for everything, you're simply going to get a reduced, distorted, and inadequate answer. I would respectfully suggest that Richard Dawkins does use it for everything, and that his answers actually are purely what science allows us to see. And that is a very narrow segment of the rich spectrum of knowledge that I think we as human beings need. I welcome science, but it's part of a spectrum of knowledge. It doesn't determine that knowledge in its totality.
Absolutely. And one of the people that you highlight in your book is Rosenberg, Alex Rosenberg, who tries to, understand reality through a purely scientific perspective. And, it's not only incoherent, but it's also very unsatisfying and quite, I think there's one part where you quote him talking about taking antidepressants.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, Rosenberg is saying if we limit reality to what science is able to tell us, or more accurately, what physics is able to tell us, then you do away with questions of meaning and so on. And my point is very, very simple, that all he's doing is unnecessarily limiting himself to one avenue of exploration, and there are many, many others that need to be explored. And I think that for many of his critics who are atheists and who are very embarrassed by his quite inadequate approach, they would say, look, you cannot simply say, because science does not disclose meaning, there is no meaning. So the most you can conclude is that science is unable to help us find meaning, leaving the door open to use other ways of finding meaning.
Absolutely. And to end this stream, I wanted to just highlight the conclusion in your book. You write, in the end, we are all believers, whether we like it or not, in that our lives and knowledge are grounded and shaped by assumptions and beliefs that lie beyond comprehensive empirical verification or rational proof.
Well, I think that's right. But the key point I make is we can do this. We can flourish in this world, and accepting the idea of belief is the way to do it.
Absolutely. And I love the way that you summarized it it wasn't actually in the book. It's something that you wrote as an article. And you said words to the effect of, it's not a nice to have. It's not a add-on. It's a necessary element for us to be able to live.
It is. That's the way we are as human beings. And to be humane is to recognize who we are as humans.
Brilliant. So I recommend all of the viewers, please get this brilliant book. It's one of those things that if you have someone that you know amongst your friends and your family who don't, they don't take any of this seriously, I'm sure this book will make them rethink why holding beliefs is actually important. Professor, you've been, publishing for many, many years, and, people really look forward to your next sort of book. So what else are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on a book that brings together my own personal interest in C.S. Lewis and, of course, my long-standing interest in science and religion. And the book, unsurprisingly, is on C.S. Lewis, on science and religion. So watch out for that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Professor. It's been really delightful speaking to you, and I hope to have you back on the channel again.
Well, I look forward to it. It's been a great pleasure talking with you, and thank you so much for having me.
Cheers. Bye-bye.